lecturer is here. Thank you, Michael.
I was asleep an hour ago, so.
Yes. Well, so that means your class can go to sleep.
And by the way, since I suddenly discovered this. Excuse me. Wait. No, I don't know. There's no plug in that. Kendra is not here, so if you were hoping to have her Storytime part, you're going to get the version of this lecture that we did before we added Storytime. And I hope that's okay too.
I didn't get to see that one, so.
Let's hope that the HDMI cable is still short. I've been issues, yeah, all weekend. But yesterday I was able to plug in and it worked just fine. On Friday it took like 5 minutes of them tinkering.
You actually remember what it was like before.
Okay, about 2 people here studying computers.
Don't expect us to be able to fix the projector system.
You don't keep some machines from working around in your pocket? Those are big bucks.
What kind of machines you work on? That's cool. Like photolithography stuff? I don't know what that is. That's really cool.
There's a lot about it. It's interesting to get back from. I do planting about like half a bushel year flies now.
That's cool.
I believe it. Yeah.
When you say semiconductors, you mean etching the silicon, right? That's really cool. I like that stuff a lot.
What did I say?
5 minutes ago he said, hey, you're teaching right now.
Overnight. And this is a fast. That's medicine. Literally, that was the day.
Alright. Now the moment of truth. The computer thinks I found a monitor. I didn't have to yesterday.
You want this screen move anything? That's a fun thing. That's good. Progress.
And so the monitors are indeed on. Let's see. Computer.
Progress.
No.
Alright.
That's not my computer.
Could be secondary.
Spinning wheel. The first class of the day in lecture is always a good time. Nope. Even though we're not attached to a wall. Nope, not that. I guess there's one more button to press. Let's see what that one does. No, nothing. seems like it should be the right one. So maybe I need to do something on my machine.
Did you press, I think it's Windows P to change your monitor setup?
Yeah. No, that's it.
Second movie.
There's a cold store handle in the bag. Can you grab it?
Give an indication of where it's pointing to. Here it says
It's just the one HDMI in, so
this is HDMI.
well, I appreciate your patience while we sort through this.
It sounds There was a button that was yellow and I pressed it and it's green now.
Oh, that's
I didn't realize that was a button. It just looked like an indicator.
You know what those indicators?
So input select.
In case the yellow button will be yellow.
Oh, we have something going on over here. That is new.
It says that's what HDMI is hooked up to.
it's not my desktop background, which means it's not showing me.
Is it one of those where you drag it across and it goes on that screen?
If it was,
Oh yeah.
if it was running my computer, it would show me my wallpaper. By which I mean the default wallpaper. This is some other default wallpaper. Someone want to go find Miles, maybe?
Alternatively, is there a way you could share a link to the slides on Discord with you log in on our phones?
If you think you can help, we're racking our brains over here.
Yeah, no, Google.
Windows 11 wants to be getting a lecture about history, and then you didn't get more place to projector. Oops. So yeah, everybody just get on their phones. Scan the QR code.
And so it does not detect the second one, that's the tricky thing. But I'm wired, there's an HDMI.
Oh, which is why we had
Juice.
the staff was supposed to come in and fix this. But all of us on Friday were like,
Connecting to Michael Chidester. That is promising.
Yeah,
fingers and toes.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, name save the day.
Yeah,
can't
That was
verify
my
it.
switch.
So now we
For the
can.
dagger.
By a very small subset of people that have or martial artists I don't know.
Okay, only this one's working. That's enough.
It's like
And now we can freeze enter mode. Sweet.
Yay!
All right. Thanks, Liam.
Yes, of course.
Does that mean I will now? So I can unplug from the HDMI cable, right? And this is when everything breaks. No. Okay. A couple minutes late, by which I mean 25, but here we are. Luckily, this was designed as a two-person lecture, and one of them is still waking up because we were originally scheduled for 11:30. So, it's going to be just me, Michael Chidester. We're going to talk about 15th century dueling, primarily as described by Paride del Pozzo. And here we go. So, I'm going to give a slight introduction about dueling. We're going to talk about the conditions for a duel, format of a duel, go into the funny part of the lecture, which is accounts of specific duels, and then I will take questions. I don't know if we have someone back-to-back with us, but if we have extra time at the end of this block, then we can go into the next hour, if y'all can stick around.
I
So,
would be the worst. I'm such a
what is a duel?
I know what I
Is
know
this a
about
duel?
things.
So I'm going to review a couple of section titles from a book before I tell you what the book is. So, the book says, if a pact and a cord were made to break 10 lances, and one of the two falls to the ground in an encounter before the 10 are finished, should the battle be over without waiting to break all 10 lances? This is a description of a duel format. When we're talking about duels, it might not be what you think it is. Double kills. If at the same time, one wounds the other and the other the one, from which wounds both die, which of them should be the victor? These are the questions that keep samurai up at night. Mounted versus dismounted. If two knights are challenged to fight on horseback and one of them dismounts and kills his enemy on foot, should he justly be the victor? These are the chapter titles of the first 3 chapters of Book 8 of 9. In the treatise of an Italian man called Paride del Pozzo, or in Latin, it's Paride del Pozzo, for reasons that aren't important. Who was this guy? He was born in Piemonte in 1410. He studied law at universities all over Italy. He was a legal advisor to Alfonso V of Aragon, who was also king of Napoli, or Naples. He served as general auditor and general inquisitor, and ultimately died in 1493. For many in Hima, this puts him right in the target area of the most interesting time period. And he was a big deal in terms of the law. He wrote 2 books, one of which was about what we would call, oh Jesus, I'm blanking on the word. It was about forensics. It was about rules of evidence. And his other book is called De Duelo, vel de Regnatari in Singulari Cartamine, all in Latin. It's a ridiculous 150-page long Latin treatise where every page is just a wall of text like this, no paragraph markings, nothing. In which he tries to lay out the entire dueling code, or all of the rules by which duels can be fought in Italy in his lifetime. He tries to assemble every legal precedent he could find, as well as many accounts of actual duels that happened as he could find, and he uses all these duel accounts as object lessons in the ways in which duels should be conducted legally. This book was incredibly popular. It was reprinted about 1 million times. In Latin, it was translated into Italian, actually by him, so he released the Latin version in 1471-ish, and then he translated it to Italian, published in 1476-ish. We don't quite know because there's no dates in either of these editions, We just kind of guessed based on when the printer he used was active. And both of these editions were reprinted. The book 5 of the treatise of Achille Marozzo is actually just an abridgment of his book, word for word. He took about half the chapters and put it into a shorter version of this book, and he just folded it into his work. It was translated to Spanish in 1544, and there's an English translation from 1580. Although anybody who's read English from 1580 knows that it's not quite the English that we're familiar with, especially when someone is handwriting it. This was only ever done in a manuscript, which is now in the Folger Shakespeare Library, which I have scans of. And a lot of the translations I'm going to put here are actually from that translation and not ones that I did, because it's much easier to modernize that text than try to translate the Latin or the Italian. And then there was a shortened English version published in 1590. So for about 100 years after this book came out, it was the authority on dueling. In fact, other dueling books that you'll find from the early 16th century are pretty much uniformly framed as responses to this book. Like Pedro Monte, who's a master some of you might have heard of, wrote a big old book on warfare and fencing, and an equally big book about dueling, in which basically he disagrees with this guy about a whole bunch of things. But like everything is same format, book by book, chapter by chapter, discussing the issues the way Pozzo explains them, and whether you agree or disagree. And that doesn't change till about 1550. So he has about 75 years when he was the default standard for discussing dueling. All right, what is dueling? First of all, it's not this. How many of you recognize pictures like this, where guys are wearing leather gimp suits and holding giant tower shields and clubbing each other or sometimes using swords? This is a completely unrelated legal tradition. Many people, well, so first of all, the giant shields were probably never actually used. This is probably a artistic license. The duels of this kind that we have an account of are mostly smallish center grip shields that are much more sensible. But the leather suits and the clubs, that's all recorded in German legal law, but it is not considered dueling by basically anyone. In fact, the word duel didn't exist when this was a common, well, it was never common. This was a practice that was used. This would be considered trial by combat. And it's definitely not this. As far as we know, this format never actually happened. The Ariela Elema, who's the authority on this kind of dueling, has researched it and concluded that probably what happened was there was a folktale that mentions a woman fighting a giant, and the giant had to stand in a hole so he would be human-sized. And somehow through the telephone game, that made its way into legal records as a precedent for if a woman ever has to fight a man, this is how it should be done. But the only record of a man versus woman duel that we have happened in Bern, Switzerland, in the 1280s. And this is the art that the Chronicle gives for it, which is also probably not what happened. She probably was not wearing a fancy dress while fighting a guy in armor. But the Chronicle does mention that she won. However, there's no information about a rock in a veil or a man in a hole or anything like that. So, when we look at trial by combat, there's this weird mix of sort of fantasy and reality that we see in fencing manuals. But as far as dueling authorities were concerned, the Battle of Two is a completely separate concept. And they would not have seen them as different versions of dueling. That's a trial, this is a duel. Typically, these were fought by knights and men-at-arms. And actually, Pozzo has an interesting part where he says that a knight cannot justly refuse the challenge of a common soldier who has at least 5 years of experience fighting in wars, because the way he frames it is, arms grant nobility. And the entire point of this was demonstrating one's skill as a warrior. So a sufficiently experienced common soldier had gained social status equal to a knight in terms of being able to challenge and receive challenges. And there's actually a whole section of Pozzo that's all about rank-based protocol, with chapters like, if a king challenges an emperor, must the emperor accept, or can the emperor use a second? If a count challenges a knight, and like all of these hierarchies about how high status you have to be to ignore a challenge. But he's quite clear that even though commoners don't have all the same legal rights as nobility, when it comes to dueling, if they are veterans, then they have the same status as normal knights. This is because the format of this dispute resolution that's done by proving that you are the more effective warrior, and therefore you are in the right in this. Am I skipping ahead? You have a question.
Was it common for nobility or knights to have less than 5 years experience, where there would be a thing of, I'm a noble, I've not touched the battlefield, here's a veteran who does have experience? Was that common to have nobility without experience?
I mean, there might have been people like that, but by and large, they probably wouldn't have been getting involved in duels.
Yeah.
So the thing that in... Alright, I'm gonna... So, my notes on this slide are not quite comprehensive enough for you to know all the points I'm going to make here, but I will jump to something that I might have meant to bring up later, which is the way this emerges is in the 100 Years' War is merely the first time when large multinational medieval armies were fighting, mostly in France. But they were bringing mercenaries in from all over Europe, and they developed this common understanding of the rules of warfare, which they call the jus belli, or the law of war. And this is where things like taking your enemy for ransom, and if a knight surrenders to you, you don't kill the knight, you instead get paid to return to his people. These sorts of customs that you hear about knights doing are all part of this law of war that was designed to keep everything from becoming completely deadly and barbaric and so on, to make sure that the people who were out there fighting these wars, often for other countries, were not just doing suicidal things. So that it kept everybody a little bit safer and kept things more predictable, because in combat, if it's predictable, then you often can avoid not dying. So this was framed as a battle of two, because these duels were expected to be fought following exactly the same conventions as a large field battle with armies. And this actually emerges as a practice in military encampments, where if two soldiers or two knights have a dispute that they can't settle peacefully, then their commanders would force them to fight it out in front of all the other troops. And they'd build a ring, and they'd put them in there and have them put on their best war equipment and use their actual weapons of warfare and settle the fight. And then when those veterans start coming back from the 100 Years' War, and they say, well, I want to settle this the old-fashioned way, like we used to do back in the war, then cities were forced to begin accommodating these same kinds of duels, because if they didn't, it would happen anyways, but the city would lose control of the situation. So you start seeing dueling appear in city law in the early 15th century for the same reason. All these knights and mercenaries understood this was like what the format for this was, and they're like, no, we're going to do it the proper way. And because you're using your actual fighting armor and your actual fighting weapons and your actual war horse, you can prove that you're the better warrior. And therefore, because the entire purpose of the knighthood was to be the best warriors possible, that demonstrates your virtue. And you basically have to outnight your opponent. Pozzo has two different books. Yeah.
Shit, sorry. Is that like the main reason we're seeing duels? Is like a proof of ability more than is that the dispute that's being settled?
I'm gonna point more to that as I go through these slides.
Sorry.
I'm kind of getting way ahead of myself a little bit, because this idea kind of needs to be expressed in one chunk. When Pozzo is justifying duels, that's not where he goes in his introductory chapters. And actually, it's interesting because the Latin and Italian introductions are quite different, because they have different audiences. So his Latin book was written for other lawyers. And his Italian book was written for nobility, who didn't necessarily read Latin. So in the Latin version, he talks about all the ancient legal precedents for fighting duels, and Frankish law, and Roman law, and he goes through all of this stuff, Charlemagne and so on. Whereas in the Italian version, it's all about David and Goliath. As the example of, clearly, this is a case where two people fought and God chose the victor, and shows us that it's justified to have the dispute where two people can fight and let God sort it out. So, reasons for dueling are important because they frame the whole discussion. And we have to go to an earlier authority because Pozzo doesn't actually cover this part. He says there's an earlier dueling authority from the 14th century called John of Legnano. He says there's 3 reasons people duel: for hatred, for glory, or for compurgation. And compurgation is a funny word. What it means is to purge yourself of an accusation. So if you've been accused unjustly, then you have to do compurgation to remove the accusation because it's a stain on you, right? Is the idea. And so what he says is that hatred is an unworthy reason to fight a duel. So duels for hatred should not be allowed. Duels for glory is a great reason to fight a duel because knighthood at the end of the day is basically a cult of glory seeking. And so all they want to do all the time is get the most glory possible, not just for selfish reasons, but because glory was social capital.